Welcome to the National Gallery Victoria. My name is Amanda Dunsmore and I'm the Senior Curator of International Decorative Arts and Antiquities. And we're here today in the 19th century Decorative Arts Gallery, where we're going to take a tour through the 19th century. The 19th century is characterised by enormous advances in art manufacturing, alongside the rise of movements that railed against machine production. The works in this gallery chart the various artistic movements, stylistic advances that reflect the rise of the Industrial Revolution, consumerism, the rise of the middling classes, and then debate around the role of art in society. But we're going to start here on the cusp of the late 18th and early 19th centuries with these magnificent Wedgwood pieces. The gallery has one of the most significant collections of Wedgwood in the world, and we have highly significant works here by Wedgwood himself. In particular, this wonderful covered vase on a pedestal known as the Home of Vase. And in terms of the context of our discussion today, this really is the epitome of neoclassicism, the neoclassical movement in the late 18th century. It is elegant and refined and inspired. The form and the decoration are inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, and we see that in the form of this vase, the amphora shape of the vase, and the motifs on it. It is all about Homer, the great author and poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and his deification is what we're looking at here on this vase. The finial on the lid is Pegasus, the winged horse. The handles are snakes ending in Medusa heads, and it all sits on this drum pedestal, also inspired, the form inspired by classical antiquity, and the decoration also through the swags of floral motifs and the trophies hanging around it. So it is, this vase in particular is the epitome of elegant neoclassicism at the end of the 18th century. Similarly, this Tarza vase here, directly imitating an ancient Greek cup or a cantharos. And again, the decoration on it classically inspired, the motifs all classical in inspiration. But it's interesting to compare the lightness and the elegance of these forms with the rise of the Regency movement in the early 19th century, which we see epitomised in some of these silver works over here in this case. And it's interesting to compare particularly that cantharos or Tarza vase with this covered cup on the lower level by Paul Storr. So we're in the early 19th century now, and as I've mentioned, we see this particular period in time which is known as the Regency Period, and it really dates very specifically to 1811 to 1820, and it is when the Prince Regent George, who was later to become George IV, ruled as Prince Regent in the last illness of his father, during the last illness of his father George III. And it is known from this time, it is known, this period of design and art in England is known as the Regency Period. It is characterised by an interpretation of neoclassicism, but it's a far more robust interpretation than the elegance of the late 18th century in the works of Wedgwood. We see really, really strong forms here, much more masculine almost in design, and you can see that in the covered tureen and this covered vase, and the tray in particular. Regency silver work at this time is really characterised by heavily cast silver, often with gilt decoration that we see on these works as well. Still with those neoclassical motifs and decoration, but the forms are far more strong and masculine and robust in design. And then we come across here, we have some wonderful examples of furniture, Regency furniture in the collection, and I point out particularly this pair of pole screens here. And a pole screen was a screen literally for shielding the faces, particularly of ladies, in front of the fire. And they actually are adjustable so that they can slide up and down the pole depending on how tall you were, so that it just protected your face at that right spot from the heat of the fire. But what's of interest here, of course, is all the classical imagery that we're looking at here. Once again, in that very robust sense of neoclassicism. The lion's paw feet, the tripod base, this shield shape screen as such, and then the actual elements of decoration on the screen as well. The so-called Zeus thunderbolt, a decorative motif relating to the god Zeus, and of course the pairs of wings as well. So all very clear, strong classical imagery. Thomas Hope was one of the leading design reformers actually of the early 19th century. He was obscenely wealthy, came from a Dutch banking family, and he travelled a lot. He amassed enormous collections on his grand tour travels through Egypt and Turkey, Greece and Italy, and came back to England with enormous, stupendous collections of classical antiquities in particular and Egyptian antiquities. And he's famous for his house in London, in Duchess Street, Portland Square, which was built by Robert Adam, the house that he bought, the leading designer of the late 18th century in neoclassicism. So Thomas Hope bought this house and then proceeded to remodel the interiors completely. And each room that he remodeled had a particular theme. He had 4 rooms for his vase collection alone, his classical vase collection, and he had an Egyptian room and numerous other rooms in the house too that were all themed accordingly to his collections. And these pair of pole screens in the NGV's collection is actually from the drawing room in his house. It was a particularly famous house. He actually opened it up to certain members of the public, select members, to come and visit, and in fact he actually ended up selling tickets to people to come and visit the house and come and look at it. The interiors of it are well publicised. He published a book on interior design in which he published many of the interiors in line drawings of his house, sadly now pulled down. One of the other leading furniture designers of the Regency period was George Bullock, the designer of this commode here, and again we see that very, very masculine, heavy, robust neoclassical design. But in this we also see elements of Egyptian design as well in the vertical columns, which are lotus buds placed end to end to form the columns, but also Greek motifs in the brass inlay of veneered surfaces. A very typical design of George Bullock, and in fact Bullock was actually commissioned by the British government to design all of the furniture for Longwood. Longwood was the house on St Helena where Napoleon was famously exiled, and George Bullock was commissioned to design all of the furniture for the interiors, including a commode of this design. So this is another example of that commode that he designed for Napoleon's house on St Helena. Moving across to the other side of the gallery, we're going to look at works that look at historical revivalism. We'll start here with this case over here. Some of the works here look at the influence of the Middle East and Orientalism in design of the 19th century, but in particular in this case I wanted to just look at a couple of works that really look at the NeoRenaissance design. So in the early 19th century, on that first half of the 19th century, alongside the Regency period, which as I said was that very specific period, we see the rise of historical revivalism designs, if you like. We see this plethora of designs that emerge that are inspired by designing from earlier periods, and in particular designs directly taken from antiquity, from ancient Greece and Rome, also the Renaissance period, and then the Baroque of the 17th century and the Rococo period of the 18th century. And in this case, we see the influence of Renaissance design in the 2 ceramic vases here. This one by Minton and the one with its stand below, this ewer and stand by the Meissen manufactory. And both are imitative of Limoges enamels, so enamelled metal vases of the 16th century. But of course these are late 19th century in date, but they are directly imitative of works of the 16th century. And they're very much, I guess, produced for the newly moneyed members of the 19th century, if you like, the rising middle classes that wish to show, to position themselves in society and to show their taste and their wealth. And so to have works that say have lineage that goes back to the, at least decorative lineage that goes back to the Renaissance period was obviously to be greatly desired. The Meissen ewer and stand in particular is a really fine piece. Meissen really undertook a great revival during the 19th century, from the mid-19th century onwards, and really came to the fore as one of those leading porcelain manufacturers in producing high quality decorative decorative wares. And we see that in the production of this really exquisite and elegant ewer on its stand with the painted grisaille decoration. This work, in fact, was actually acquired by the NGV at the Melbourne International Exhibition of 1880. And then just to mention a couple of the pieces of furniture on the plinth here. Again, all these pieces are looking at historical revivalism, I should say. And these two pieces in particular, the cabinet and the card table, are imitative of French furniture of the late 17th century. French furniture never went out of fashion. French furniture was always regarded as the epitome of design and taste and quality and craftsmanship. And this was still highly valued in the 19th century, and we see many furniture manufacturers and designers riffing on French furniture design of earlier periods. In this case, the late 17th century and the Baroque productions of André Charles Boulle, who was the leading cabinet maker for Louis XIV. And he really promoted, he didn't invent this style of decoration, but he really promoted this particular style of surface decoration whereby the ebony structure of the piece was then inlaid with tortoiseshell, or veneered I should say, with tortoiseshell, as we see here on this piece, on the top and on the legs and the sides. And then within the tortoiseshell it was then inlaid with metalwork, in this case brass, which creates those very beautiful scrolling pattern work within the tortoiseshell. The brass is actually dulled over time, but when these pieces were made new, and also in the 17th century, the brass would have been very highly reflective and shiny, and it would really pop against the deeper, richer colours of the tortoiseshell veneer behind it. And they were also characterised by these very finely chased and crafted ormolu mounts that we see on the knees and on the central medallion of this card table. And with this proliferation of decorative design that was often coupled together on single objects, we see, as we go around the corner, we see the rise of neo-Gothic design around the 1840s. Neo-Gothic design, actually, which is what we're looking at when we see these works on this plinth here, was also, you could say, a historical revivalist design, and it was about very much turning to medievalism and the design of cathedrals and Gothic design as a reflection of native British values. The greatest advocate for Neo-Gothicism in Britain was a man called Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, or AWN Pugin as he's known. Pugin was an architect and a designer, and he really dedicated himself to the revival of Gothic design in Britain in the sort of around the mid-19th century. He died quite young, in his 40s, but he achieved an enormous amount in his short life. Pugin designed, as I said, worked both as an architect and as a designer for the interiors of these spaces. He designed numerous churches, and in fact several churches in Tasmania are Pugin designs, although he never actually visited Australia. But he was also well known for his interior design work in both textiles and the objects that furnished his designs. He was one of the architects for the British Houses of Parliament, in fact, and this pair of chairs that we're looking at is based upon a design of chairs in the Houses of Parliament in London. The cross frame of it and the detailing of it are referenced in the Houses of Parliament chairs and reflect medieval design work in their structure. The beautiful library table here too, we see the decoration here. The decoration is actually within the structure. Pugin was not an advocate for added ornament as such, that he felt that the ornament needed to be contained within the object or embedded within the object itself. And so we see in the upright supports on each side of the table the beautiful pierced and gilt work taken directly from Gothic architecture, almost like looking through the windows of a Gothic cathedral. And also the very beautiful inlaid marquetry on the top of the table is taken directly from Gothic imagery. The plate on the wall is also a Pugin design made by the Minton manufactory, and the colour scheme of it is actually taken from medieval tiles in that encaustic technique, or that so-called inlaid technique, if you like, of different coloured clays within the tiles. And it has, of course, a very moralising motto around the edges of the bread plate that says "waste not, want not," very reflective of Pugin's Christian morals. And this pair of wonderful, enormous pair of candlesticks, originally from a set of 6 candlesticks, again a Pugin design and made by John Hardman, a Birmingham manufactory. They're made in brass, and the central elements of them are enamelled, again very much in a medieval technique. And in this one you see the monogram of MR, or Maria Regina, as in Mary Queen of Heaven. And these candlesticks would have been made for an altarpiece in a church, or for the altar table. And with this monogram MR referring to Mary, they were most likely for an altar for the Virgin Mary herself. And we come from Neo-Gothicism. We see the rise of the arts and crafts movement in the mid-19th century, with works on this plinth and also in the wall case over here. The arts and crafts movement was really led by one man, most famous designer of the 19th century in England at least, William Morris. William Morris railed against the Industrial Revolution and mechanised production, machine production. So the arts and crafts movement was very much about the celebration of hand craftsmanship, or hanging on to the ideals of hand craftsmanship, and not just in celebrating an artist, but also in the labourer, or the man or the person who actually crafted the object, and that there was there should be joy in labour and in life in that sense. And so we see in this wonderful sideboard here, designed by Bruce Talbot and made by a leading British manufacturer of furniture, cabinet makers, Gillow & Co. This wonderful sideboard embodying those principles of the arts and crafts movement. It's made of oak, and oak, of course, was that great timber in Britain that furniture had been made from for centuries, particularly vernacular furniture from the medieval period right through. And so here we see an oak sideboard, not veneered with other exotic timbers at all. It is a celebration of the British timber. It's not a polished surface, it's a naturally oiled surface. So it's not trying to present it in any other way than what the timber is, and celebrating the natural beauty. And this was one of those principles of the arts and crafts movement that celebrated the natural materials and truth to materials, if you like. And it is inlaid with these beautiful panels of boxwood, beautifully carved and handcrafted, as well as the wonderfully finely detailed hinges, which make enormous hinges, in fact, which make a nod, of course, directly to medieval craftsmanship and cabinetry. There's also beautiful carved inscription across the top of the sideboard in Latin, of course, but what it translates as is effectively saying that it is better to be invited to dine on vegetables made with love than to dine on the fatted calf prepared with hatred. Again, another great moralising motto in keeping with the Pugin motto on the bread plate of "waste not, want not." The wallpaper on the back wall is a design by William Morris as well, the scroll pattern. The scroll pattern itself making direct reference to medieval design work and imagery. William Morris is synonymous now with the designs of wallpapers of the mid-19th century, and he pioneered the block printing technique of wallpapers. They were not actually that popular, certainly in the earlier years of their production. They were very costly and expensive, and they had a certain mechanised look about them. But William Morris actually was very frank about this with his workmen, in saying that they should just embrace the fact that it's going to look like a mechanised production of stamping out the patterns, rather than they should not try to take the time to produce them as if they looked like perfectly hand-painted wallpapers, because that was clearly never going to be possible. the style of these two chairs, they're referred to as the Sussex chair. That's the style of this model. They were designed by Philip Webb, who was a designer that worked with William Morris for his interior decorating business. And Webb designed this chair, as I said, referred to as the Sussex chair, and it's based upon a chair that apparently was found in Sussex, and it really espouses all those vernacular ideals of country vernacular furniture, and the way that all the elements of it effectively fit together very easily, and the very beautifully toned elements of the verticals and the horizontals, and of course the natural rush seat as well, all very classic elements of a vernacular style of furniture. Just to look at one object in this case over here too, this beautiful silver muffin dish, so-called muffin dish, on the end of the case, on the left-hand end here. And this is designed by a man named Charles Robert Ashby, and was produced by his Guild of Handicraft that he established in the 1880s. Ashby was a great protege and a follower of William Morris. He really espoused all those socialist ideals that Morris held about society and about the integration of art and design into people's everyday lives, and that it was there to enhance and to bring beauty into people's lives, and that it should be available to as many people as possible. And he also espoused handcrafted ideals as well. So he established this Guild of Handicraft, as I said, in the 1880s, which specialised in producing metalwork, particularly silverwork, domestic objects and furniture. And so this beautiful muffin dish is made by the Guild of Handicraft, and when you look at it, you see the reflective surface of it, which reflects the beaten quality of it, the hand-beaten quality. You can see the hammer marks all over the silver where it has been physically hammered out into shape. The ornament is minimal. It is just the finial, literally, that is one decorative element, but it is also the functional element of it as well. And the beauty of this work is in the handcrafted nature of it, and that very subtle reflective quality of the surfaces of the work. We're going to come through to the end space of the gallery. And we come round to this plinth of works, which are looking at, the works on this plinth are looking at the rise of the aesthetic movement, or aestheticism, in Britain in the late 19th century. And aestheticism really arose out of a reaction against the arts and crafts movement. In fact, it was, I guess, the primary principles, the basic principles of aestheticism were that art should be purely about pleasure and pleasuring the senses. It was not about any sort of moralizing effort, and not about the craftsmanship per se and the hand craftsmanship. Manufacturing didn't come into it. The rallying cry, in fact, was art for art's sake, and art was there to give pleasure and enjoyment at that very visual level. And so we see a number of works here that espouse principles of and decorative elements of the aesthetic movement. It was heavily influenced by Japanese design, and we see from the 1850s onwards, we see the rise of what we now refer to as Japanism, which is the influence of Japanese art and design on Western design in the second half of the 19th century, when Japan was forced to open up to the West. And we see this influx of Japanese art and design coming into Europe and America, and really prompting a revolution in art and design across Europe. We see on this wonderful sideboard here of the 1870s, and the decorative panels on this sideboard are designed by John Moore Smith. But this sideboard actually has elements of both arts and crafts and aesthetic or Japanist influences in it. Morris himself actually also produced furniture that was ebonized as well, so this use of blackening of the surfaces, the varnishing of surfaces, was an aspect of arts and crafts design, but as I said, it was also very much a taste for aesthetic furniture as well. You can see the huge hinges on the doors, oversized hinges, of course. They are largely decorative. They're functional, but they're also largely decorative, and of course they're quite medieval in their inspiration. So you could say there's arts and crafts elements there in that. Also the actual decorative panels are also inspired by Gothic design in both the decorative panels on the doors here, a figure of a jester and a scholar sitting reading a book. The four winds, the motifs of the four faces are the four winds. There are both arts and crafts and Japanist influences in this beautifully crafted sideboard. I should point out the turning or the reading on the vertical elements here as well is a very popular element of craftsmanship, but the overall black varnished effect of this sideboard is very much referencing Japanese lacquer and in its aesthetic. And we have another wonderful sideboard in the collection by Godwin, also ebonized, but much more ascetic in design and pared back and less ornamented and very much directly influenced by Japanese design. The baluster element of this element of a baluster on the wall here in cast iron. This comes out of a house, a late Victorian house in Melbourne, part of a railing, probably of the upper balcony of a terrace house, and it's full of aesthetic imagery and motifs. We see the sunburst, the quarter sunburst in the top right corner, the chrysanthemum flower. Of course, the chrysanthemum is the symbol of Japan, and it was of the national floral symbol of Japan, and it became a very popular motif of the aesthetic movement. The Vitruvian wave motif that cuts right through the whole design on an angle, again is another Japanese motif. And then you see the grid motif again coming in that sort of bamboo imitative grid up in the top left corner. So it's filled with all those sort of typical elements of decorative elements that you would expect to see on an aesthetic design. Similarly, on this beautiful vase too, by the Minton Manufactory. It's typically eclectic sort of vase in its design and decoration. Typically eclectic of the late 19th century, covered with aesthetic inspired imagery, but of course the form itself is very classical in inspiration. It's an amphora form, classic amphora form. And there are influences of Orientalism in the design or the decoration on it, but there are also lots of classic aesthetic movement elements in it as well, decorative elements. The grid pattern over the background, this half chrysanthemum flower at the top of the field of decoration, the vase, the classical urn, if you like, with the spray of flowers out of it. Very aesthetic in inspiration. At the same time as the aesthetic movement is in full swing, we see the rise of another British designer who was a great design reformer at the end of the 19th century, and that is Christopher Dresser, Dr. Christopher Dresser. And all the objects in this case are designed by Christopher Dresser. He really was the leading design reformer in Britain at the end of the 19th century. He actually trained as a botanist. He had a PhD from a university in Germany, and he worked as a botanist for several years. And he very much took that interest in science with him when he moved into artistic design in the 1860s. And in fact, he was very much a promoter of science and art together. And he's really regarded as one of the first or the earliest industrial designers in that sense, because he designed for numerous manufacturers across the fields of decorative arts. So metalwork manufacturers, ceramic manufacturers, and a number of ceramic manufacturers. He designed cast iron furniture, textiles, and a whole array of works of interior decoration, shall we say, or household works. And we see here a letter rack and a toast rack. The toast rack here is so progressive in its design. This is 1880, but it actually could have been made yesterday, or designed yesterday It is so far ahead of its time. You can see the way, the way it's designed so that the toast would sit in it on an angle, on a slant, so that the heat from the piece of toast below would hopefully, just go through the toast above to keep a bit of heat in there in the toast, but not to let them go soggy either. Incredibly geometric in form and restrained as well. It is devoid of any decoration beyond what is functional. And Dresser was famous for his mantra of form following function. We see that in particular, or most illustrated here in this wonderful toast rack. Some of the other works in here are earlier in date, in particular this wonderful match pot on the right here with its wonderful decoration of, I think it's 1860s, in relation to a dog, and we're looking at one side of the decoration that says our dog Tray in the spirit. The dog was named Tray, and on the other side of the vase we have our dog Tray in the flesh with this wonderful design of a dog's head on the other side. Moving on, we're just going to finish over here with this plinth of works by Carlo Bugatti of the late 19th, early 20th century. Carlo Bugatti is unique, one has to say, even just looking at his furniture designs. Carlo Bugatti emerged as a furniture designer in the late 19th century in Milan, in Italy. He is absolutely unique in his design aesthetic. It's quite clear that he is influenced by the prevailing taste for Orientalist design, as we see amongst many designers of the later 19th century. But it's Carlo Bugatti's very idiosyncratic combination of different design elements that make his works unique. We see influences of Japanese design as well, but particularly in these four pieces, the mirror and the three pieces here, we see mainly an Orientalist aesthetic coming through. And as I said, they're utterly unique in their creation. He combined a whole range of materials, and we see it best, if you like, on this chair and lady's writing desk. The surface of the chair and the seat and the top of the writing desk are vellum, and then they've been beautifully painted in a wash or a watercolour, with a very whimsical design, very Japanese inspired, with elements of nature or decorative elements. And then the drawers themselves are also, the fronts of the drawers are inlaid with pewter. But in this, the motifs are very whimsical, unrelated. They're quite abstract, many of them. Some have a sense of making reference to Japanese kanji characters, but in fact they're all effectively nonsensical. But they are all of Bugatti's own inspiration, shall we say, and creation. He's also very well known at this time in his furniture for the beaten repoussé work, the copper work or brass work I should say, that he uses to wrap around his works or to produce as decorative motifs. You can see the round elements here, and then the uprights on the chair are wrapped literally with strips of beaten brass that have been stamped with decorative elements, and we see that around the front edge of the desk. So practical but also highly decorative, and again you see it here as a decorative element on the legs of this desk as well. He also used a lot of tassels on his pieces as well, which we see of course on the desk and this chair that goes with the desk, and it's likely too on this lovely little side table here that it had tassel work around it originally. We got no evidence of that, but just understanding his design work in the 1880s, it's most likely that work had tassels all around it. But then we cut to 1902 and this most extraordinary work here. It is the most extraordinary work in this gallery, really. I have to say, it is a chair based on a design that he produced for an international fair in Italy, which was one of the international fairs specifically celebrating decorative arts. And Bugatti actually had 4 rooms that he designed for this international fair, and the most famous room, and that we have the most information on, is the so-called snail room, from which this particular chair came, or the design of this chair came. And the interior of this room was basically a banquette that ran around the wall, and it came around in a big horseshoe curve, and it ended in this enormous sort of curved form like the back of a snail. But in fact that was the drinks cabinet. The centre of that cabinet you actually opened and it was for drinks. And within this horseshoe shape you had the table, a round table, and then surrounded by 4 of these extraordinary chairs. And so hence the title of this room known as the snail room, but because of the form, particularly of the drinks cabinet. But all of these elements in this room were actually covered in vellum. The banquette and the drinks cabinet and the table and the chairs literally enveloped and wrapped in vellum with a wooden substrate, and then painted in this most exquisite decoration that you see. In fact, on the seat we see the decorative elements are dragonflies that form this wonderful geometric pattern that sort of shoots off from the centre of the chair, and then these wonderful floral, very stylised floral motifs and insectoid type decorative elements that run up the sides of the chair, of the so-called, it's hardly legs, the support for the seat. And we see just one nod to his earlier Orientalist furniture in the circular brass-covered element in the backrest of the chair, but otherwise he has moved completely away from any sense of traditional styled 4-legged pieces of furniture through, semi-traditional, shall we say, through to this quite unique inspiration for furniture design, both in its form and also in its surface decoration. The fact that it is completely enveloped, it's like skin, it's completely enveloped in vellum and decorated as such. And then the form of it is so extraordinary because he really is the first designer, as far as we're aware, to actually produce a chair which dispenses with legs. The whole chair itself is actually one form in this beautiful curved S form, and in fact it really presages injection moulded plastic chairs, if you like, of the mid-20th century. He is completely and utterly ahead of his time, and there was no one else like him at the time, despite the fact that he fitted into this world of an Orientalist aesthetic. When we reach 1902 with this chair, he is completely out there on his own, and very much someone, along with Christopher Dresser on the other side of the room, that really takes us through into the beginnings of modernism in the 20th century. There's just one more aspect of the 19th century gallery that I'd like to talk about, and this is an area that we're very keen to develop further, and it is these works on the plinth here at the end of the space, so-called shaker design. And these works are produced, these are American works, they're produced by communities that emerged in the United States in the late 18th century, and they were known as the United Society for the Believers in the Second Coming of Christ, or otherwise known as the Shakers. And the term shaker actually, as I understand it, refers more to their quite particular dance movements when they were worshipping, hence why they are referred to as Shakers. They were a Protestant sect that came to the United States from England in the late 18th century, and they really were at their most prominent by the mid-19th century, based mainly on the east coast states of the United States. And one of the largest communities was at a place called New Lebanon in upstate New York. The Shakers shared, I guess, similar aesthetics and aesthetic and a certain degree of similarity in beliefs with the Quaker movement, but they are quite unique and separate at the same time. They lived by a very strict set of rules which governed the way they lived and the way they interacted. They really did live apart from American society, and they lived a very self-sustaining lifestyle. And so they grew all their own food, they built their own houses, and they handcrafted all their own objects that they used and worked with and lived with, and made their own textiles as well for clothing, etc. And so we have in the collection now a beautiful selection of works by Shaker communities. I might start here with the rocking chair. The Shakers are famous, in fact, for their chair production. They actually did make, even though they lived apart from the rest of society, they were also realists in one sense, in that they did need the finance to survive, so they actually produced furniture for sale to the outside world. And then they produced furniture, of course, for themselves. And this particular armchair was produced for the Shaker community itself. Rocking chairs are a very particular style that the Shakers celebrated and made many examples of. And of course, it's based on a much earlier form of chair that had been around for centuries, usually used for the elderly and the infirm. In the Shaker communities, it was the older members of society or the elders that would traditionally have used the rocking chair in their retiring rooms. But it is the simplicity of design. But when I say simplicity, it's a very sophisticated design and craftsmanship, which creates this very simple, beautiful aesthetic, or so-called simple aesthetic, I should say. The elements are beautifully turned and crafted, and it's one of those pieces that keeps on rewarding. The more you look at it, the more detail you see and appreciate in the way it's been put together and finely detailed. There are elements of detailing that at first you may not appreciate, and they are those very subtle decorative elements that otherwise you would say it's a very plain, not simple, but a very restrained design. And then looking over here, we have this beautiful selection of covered boxes, storage boxes, and this oval carrier, a wooden basket basically. Both of these works, the boxes and the carrier, obviously were made for everyday life. They were used, even though they have a very high aesthetic quality to them. The boxes, you can see, were produced in a range of colours, and in fact, contrary to what some of our understanding is of Shaker society, their interiors were actually highly coloured. They actually used a number of colours, although these colours were very strictly regulated, but essentially the primary colours and versions of those primary colours were used in the painting and the decoration of their interiors. And we see those colours here manifested in these beautiful boxes as well. And of course they made them in, you can see, in a range of sizes. And the boxes literally would have been stacked like that on the tables within the interiors. And they would have been used for storing a whole range of everyday products, both organic, so seeds, pigments for paints, sewing implements, nails for woodworking and construction. Anything and everything would have been used in these boxes. But they were clearly also very well cared for and looked after and appreciated. And you can see the degree of craftsmanship and quality in the manufacturing of these boxes, in the way they're constructed. It's a bent wood technique, effectively. Using both pine and maple. The pine would have been for the base of the box, and the maple is for the walls and for the lid. And in this carrier, the handle is actually made from ash wood as well. And that is, the different woods are actually very particular in relation to their function of the craftsmanship of the works and the strengths of the timber for the different elements. But you can see when you look at this beautiful carrier, the way the wood actually tapers in. It's been tapered. It's a thin piece of wood to start with, and it's bent on an extreme curve, but it is then also tapered in, both physically tapered and then also flattened, tapered in, to just meld in beautifully those lappet ends, where they're then tacked in with little copper rivets. They are all of them both exquisitely produced objects, and it's really the craftsmanship and that ascetic quality, if you like, that lack of overt ornament, or any ornament in fact, the visual attraction being in the physical craftsmanship of the object and the coloured surface of the object that provided the visual interest. And it is those aspects and qualities of Shaker design that are so celebrated today, and why we are so interested to develop this area of the decorative arts collection. This concludes the tour today of our 19th century decorative arts gallery. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Please come in and visit the gallery now that we're open, and come and look at these magnificent works in the flesh.